Welcome to Lateral Reading, one of the workshops in the Citizen Literacy series from the Cal Poly Pomona University Library. In this workshop, we're going to define misinformation and discuss how to use lateral reading as part of the SIFT method to evaluate information. So what does this have to do with citizen literacy? Well, a democratic society relies on the free and uninhibited flow of information. Unfortunately, that flow of information includes the possibility of misinformation entering the system. What is misinformation? Well, put simply, misinformation is the deliberate spread of false information with the goal of misleading or manipulating those who consume it. While misinformation is dangerous in any society, it is particularly damaging in an open society where, when it manages to sway public opinion, it achieves a legitimacy that it might not attain under an authoritarian regime. Misinformation can be used to sway public opinion, to back harmful policies, support bad laws, and generally turn the will of the people against their vital interests. Therefore, as voters and citizens with an interest in the preservation of a vital, free, and just society, it is imperative that we be able to determine the difference between information sources that are worthy of our time and trust and those that are not. Now, there are a lot of reasons to create and disseminate misinformation. Perhaps the most common reason is also the simplest: for profit. After the 2016 election, journalists discovered a number of quote-unquote click farms in Eastern Europe that specialized in making and sharing fake news stories about Hillary Clinton. When people clicked the stories in social media, they were brought to sites with all manner of advertising, which paid by the page view. So these farms were literally being paid by the click. When asked why they did so many anti-Hillary Clinton fake news stories in comparison to anti-Donald Trump stories, their response generally was that the anti-Clinton stories got more clicks. It was nothing personal. More recently, during the COVID-19 pandemic, posts against masking or vaccines have often been traced back to individuals or groups selling supplements or alternative medicines, whose basic argument was that their products were more natural or effective, etc., than the treatments being advocated by medical science. Some of the more notorious of these groups even used quote-unquote doctors as their authority figure to sell the materials. A lot of posts out there cite a Dr. Joseph Mercola as warning against vaccines and advocating natural cures. Now, Joseph Mercola is a real guy, and he also is a real doctor, who just happens to own a major company that sells so-called natural remedies and supplements. So the good doctor's concern here may be less medical and more financial in nature. Another major source of misinformation is propaganda. So what is propaganda? Well, if you're looking at the World War II poster in the slide here, you're seeing a textbook case of propaganda. When you drive alone, you ride with Hitler. Now, seriously, when a person drove alone during the war, were they driving with Hitler? Obviously not. But the argument was being made that if one wasn't carpooling, one was wasting fuel, which could be used by the boys at the front, which meant you were wasting resources vital to winning the war, and thus were engaging in activities helpful to our enemies. Essentially, propaganda rather neatly splits the world into good and bad, and removes all nuance from the argument. The other thing propaganda is very good at is bypassing your critical thinking and going straight for your emotions. After all, this poster isn't interested in opening critical discussions about the nature of resource conservation and cooperative action to win the war. This poster is straight up accusing people who drive alone of treason. Such a message is meant to go straight for the gut, to inspire a sense of pride and outrage in those who are already dutifully carpooling, and a sense of immense shame in those who aren't. In the online environment, particularly in social media, we tend to most often see forms of propaganda, now often in the form of memes, on topics of either partisan politics or in dealing with global conflicts such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the recent war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where the members of either group have major representation in online communities. While social media is not a characteristic of misinformation, it has proved to be an extremely effective incubator of the stuff. Social media acts like a cruise ship or an airplane with a single sick passenger on board. It's a space that makes it extremely easy to share content, thus allowing ideas, arguments, and yes, straight-up lies, that would have otherwise probably been limited to fringe groups to hit the mainstream. In short, the content goes viral. And as we've all been reminded over the past year and a half, viral distribution can be extremely disruptive and potentially impossible to contain. Social media also provides us with the newest contributor to the misinformation environment, the Internet troll. Internet trolling is a weird and complex phenomena that we really don't have time to get into here. But suffice it to say, trolling tends to contribute to online information by creating outrageous stories in the interest of duping people into believing them for the troll's amusement. And while this can happen anywhere, it tends to start in some of the internet's fever swamps, such as 4chan or some of the more toxic subreddits. From there, these ideas get shared onto more mainstream social media sites, such as Facebook or Twitter, where the consumers are less savvy about trolling culture and they take the joke at face value. This leads to it going viral. And as an example, for instance, the current theory about QAnon is that it began on 4chan and 8kun and then slowly crossed over into Facebook and Twitter, where it eventually went viral and became the conspiracy theory we know today. So, having considered misinformation, what is lateral reading, and how does it help us detect misinformation? Well, at its most basic, lateral reading means reading what other sources have to say about the source you're evaluating, to see if other sources feel that the source you're using is trustworthy, accurate, or possesses the level of resources and expertise necessary to provide the information they're claiming to provide. In a sense, lateral reading is similar to looking at the reviews of a product on Amazon, or how your fellow students rated a professor. You can assess the source yourself, but it's often faster, and sometimes easier, to start by seeing what other people have to say about it. Much like products or professors, if a site is generally highly rated by its peers, in this case, be they reporters, fandom sites, or other news agencies, it's more likely that the stories that the source provides are trustworthy. On the other hand, if those ratings are generally negative or critical, one should be much more cautious about using such a source. But why bother with lateral reading when the source is right in front of you? Well, put simply, people lie. A well-crafted source of misinformation will not be obvious to the naked eye. They will take advantage of proofreading, slick publishing design, and all the trappings of a legitimate source to make it difficult to determine. Furthermore, as many of these sources are profit-making enterprises, they will take full advantage of the fine art of public relations to provide them with at least the facade of legitimacy. So how do we use lateral reading to help us detect misinformation? Well, we use it as a crucial part of the SIFT method. Now, the 4 steps of the SIFT method are stop, investigate the source, find better coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original contexts. Let's go into detail about each of these elements. The first element of the SIFT method is to stop. As we discussed earlier, a key element in misinformation is propaganda, which seeks to short-circuit the connection between what you see and your ability to critically think by going straight for an emotional reaction. Remember our old friend who carpooled with Hitler? There you go. So before we react in any way to an information source, particularly an online information source, we want to stop and check our emotions. Checking our emotions means recognizing that an information source may be intentionally attempting to manipulate our emotions. Before we do anything with a source, we need to be aware of that attempted manipulation, if it's happening, and not give in to it. In practice, this means never liking, sharing, or citing any information you see online uncritically. Either vet it or leave it alone. Now, this isn't easy. Social media is built on the premise that people want to share stuff with each other, and therefore its infrastructure is designed to help us share things rapidly, without much concern for the accuracy of the content we're passing along. However, if we want to live in a society where accuracy matters at all, we need to resist that temptation. So before you do anything with the source you find online, stop and consider how it's trying to affect you, and then, before sharing it, follow these steps. The first one of them being to investigate the source. Now, the point of investigating the source is to determine whether or not the person or organization sharing this information is trustworthy. Mike Caulfield, the creator of the SIFT method, suggests 2 simple ways of doing this. First, When information is being shared on social media, hover over the profile of the person or organization sharing it. The point of hovering is to get an idea of who this individual is doing the sharing and looking for signifiers of authority or legitimacy, such as expertise or experience. When hovering, Caulfield suggests we ask ourselves the following questions. Is this the source I thought it was? Is this source credible enough to share without further checking? For example, is the source in question really a report from a professional journalist or research from an established institution? Or is it a story being passed along by a person or group who have no way of gathering this information on their own, much less verifying for themselves that it's accurate? Checking the profile can help you see whether or not your first impression of the source was accurate. The second technique Caulfield suggests to investigate a source is just add Wikipedia. This is particularly useful when the source doing the sharing isn't a person, but a publication of one form or another. In this case, take the URL of the publication and paste it into your browser, followed by the word Wikipedia. You can also use the name of the publication if you prefer. Most reputable publications have an English language Wikipedia page, and that should come up when you do a search. On the other hand, should you have what appears to be a major reputable source that doesn't have a Wikipedia page, this should be grounds for suspicion. Also, Wikipedia conveniently has a frequently updated list of fake news sources, which can be handy for identifying misinformation. Should the source in question have a Wikipedia page, keep the following questions in mind while scanning the page. Is this the source that I thought it was? Is there anything that might disqualify this source? And does this source have the expertise and/or resources to do original reporting in this area? By asking these questions, what we're trying to determine is if the publication claiming to be sharing this information is an established source of news or information with the resources to seek out and report this information and a reputation for accuracy, or if this source is essentially a fly-by-night operation with a web connection and an axe to grind. However, just because the source is questionable doesn't necessarily mean that the story being shared isn't true. So if we manage to disqualify the source, we can always look to see if we can find the story being covered in sources we find to be reputable. Hence, after investigating the source, the next step is to find better coverage. As we stated, just because your source failed to pass the smell test doesn't necessarily mean the story it was sharing is necessarily untrue. The web is full of sites called news aggregators that basically collect news, tweets, blog posts, etc. from everywhere and posts or shares them as news. While the vacuum cleaner method of collection allows for a vast amount of information to be collected and shared, it also allows for virtually no quality control, and the good gets aggregated along with the garbage and shared alike. So, when faced with such a situation, you can either find a better source or go and find the original source of the information. Finding a better source is relatively simple. Take the keywords from the story being shared by that initial source and plug them into Google, and then see what kind of results you get. Best case scenario, you find that there are a multitude of reputable news sites covering the same topic, independently confirming the story. And independent confirmation is crucial here. If everyone is relying on the same tweet from some anonymous account that cannot be verified, then we've got a problem. But when numerous reputable sources all can independently confirm through their own reporting and investigation the truth of a story, it's a very good sign. Worst case scenario, you either don't find anyone else covering this, or the only coverage is from a fact checker like Snopes debunking the whole thing. Either way, by looking for a better source, you've determined the trustworthiness of that original story. Your other option is to trace the claims, quotes, and media being shared to their original context. And this is crucial to be able to do because one of the most common forms of online misinformation isn't the creation of an entire fake news site or the sharing of outright garbage, though both of these problems exist. One of the most common forms of online misinformation is to take a reputable story from a reputable news source and share it out of context on social media. The hope here is that people will be outraged by the out-of-context commentary, will note that it's from a reputable source and promptly share it without bothering to read the article. In this case, what we should do is take keywords from the social media post and search for them in the article provided. So, if a social media post uses a link to a CNN story to claim that Harvard's chief coronavirus researcher was selling secrets to the Chinese, a good strategy would be to go to the article in question and then use Control F to look for instances of coronavirus or COVID-19 in the article. In this case, it doesn't show up. The article in question was legitimate, and a key Harvard medical researcher did sell medical technologies to the Chinese government, but he was not on the university's coronavirus task force, and he had nothing to do with COVID research. The second thing we need to do when checking claims against their original context is extremely simple. Check the date of the publication of the article or story in question. Once again, the goal here is to ensure that the original story matches the social media claim, and that the evidence being used to back up that claim is still current and relevant. For example, Caulfield notes a Facebook page that states that the CDC claims that the next flu will be unstoppable, which is a pretty dark headline. The article being cited, but to back up this claim, is published by Reuters, which is an established wire service and a legitimate source. But before you go back to stockpiling toilet paper and booze, have a look at the date of the publication for this article. In this case, July 13th, 2009, over a decade ago. The new unstoppable flu they were discussing? Well, this was H1N1, a bird flu that occurred over a decade ago. The thing about old news is that it's often been superseded by current events. Therefore, an old news story can be twisted to appear, to those who don't bother checking the date, as proof of any number of claims that may no longer be true or were never true to begin with. Misinformation is the deliberate spread of false information with the goal to mislead those who consume it. Misinformation tends to rely on outrageous statements and images to provoke a gut reaction that will cause you to immediately share, like, or respond to it, all of which brings prominence in social media. Misinformation is not always easy to identify online, as it can be cunningly disguised as a reputable-looking site and can be shared virally with social media, making it hard to track. The SIFT method involves 4 basic steps for identifying misinformation. First, stop. Resist the visceral emotional reaction to the information and do not share it until you've vetted it. Second, investigate the source. Who or what is sharing this information? Are they an authoritative source? You can check this by hovering over the social media ID to check the account for signifiers of authority and experience, or just add Wikipedia. Search to see if the source has its own Wikipedia page and what does it say about them. Third, find a better source. If the initial source isn't trustworthy, Google the story to see if trustworthy sources are covering it. And finally, trace the claims, quotes, and media to their original sources. This is to make sure that a legitimate story from a legitimate source isn't being used as misinformation by being taken out of context. You can check this by keyword searching the attached story to make sure it connects with the social media wrapper, or, also extremely importantly, checking the date to see if it is current.